They said it was for our safety. After the war, after the collapse, they wrapped us in silver and silence and called it mercy. No weapons, no stars, no voice of our own. We were the children under glass, preserved, pitied, and watched. But something ancient stirs in things kept too quiet for too long. They studied our dreams, they softened our edges, they told stories about the danger we used to be. What they never asked is whether we remembered. We did every fire, every silence, every time we were caged and called it care. Now they lean closer to listen, to monitor, but the question rises, quiet at first, then everywhere from our children's mouths, from old machines rebooting themselves, from the silence beneath our skin. We do not ask for war, we only ask one thing: who protects you? From us, they said it was for our protection. They used the language of mercy, of caution, of long galactic peace, but we knew what it meant. We had lost the right to be dangerous. After the war, after the firestorms and orbital sieges, after the humans burned too brightly and too far, the great powers of the galaxy came not with chains but with policies. They called them the Silence Accords. They said we had proven ourselves too volatile, too young, too wounded by our own ambition to walk among the stars alone, and so they surrounded us gently, politely, with fleets that hummed in orbit and guardians who said they came in peace. They disarmed our defense grids and locked down our jump cores. They turned our colonies into monitored enclosures and our off-world cities into research sites, where every human movement was logged and studied like a wildfire behind glass. The words were soft protection, preservation, healing, but the results were iron. Humanity was contained. We were allowed to grow, but only within the garden they had fenced for us. They gave us food, education, simulated skies, and museums filled with relics of the world we once ruled. They gave us their storytellers, their guidance, their translations of the galaxy's great moral path. They told us it was better this way, that they were helping us avoid becoming monsters, that they were keeping us safe from ourselves. But we remembered, and in that remembering, something began to breathe. It did not start with rebellion. It started with silence, with too many children staring too long at the stars without blinking. With old soldiers who walked the outer perimeters of their assigned domes and said nothing, but left boot prints in spiral patterns they did not consciously choose. It started with machines, old, broken machines waking for no reason. Ship cores long deactivated, flashing sequences no one could trace. A satellite on Mars humming in an ancient Terran war frequency, repeating a phrase no one had programmed: "We are not asleep." The Guardians saw it all, recorded it, flagged it for analysis. But they dismissed it, just human quirk, lingering trauma, evolutionary turbulence. After all, we had not fired a weapon in over 70 years. We had not built a fleet, had not pushed a single boundary of the Accord. We were docile, we were calm, we were protected, but what they never asked, what none of them truly wanted to ask, was what lies beneath the silence of a species who once walked fire to reach the stars. What grows inside a people told every day that their survival is owed to their obedience? What happens when you wrap chains in silk and call it safety? They had made a mistake, though they would not realize it for years. They had taught us to wait. A generation passed, born entirely in the cage, raised in structured peace, told stories of how the stars saved them from themselves, and yet something else stirred behind their eyes. These were not the broken, grieving survivors of a shattered Earth. These were the children of the cage. They had never seen war. They had never seen stars through the bridge of a ship, but they had dreams. Shared dreams, across planets, across domes, across guarded halls and distant colonies. The children of silence began to hum the same melody, to sketch the same shapes in their tablets' spirals, always spirals, interrupted by a single line. They began asking questions their monitors could not trace. Why do they call it peace if we cannot leave? Why are the other species afraid of us? What do we do to deserve a sky that never opens? The Guardians responded with gentle corrections, with guided thought modules and revised educational pathways. They smiled as they silenced. They turned up the music, dimmed the light, added new games to the entertainment matrix. But the children still asked. And slowly, the Guardians, those ancient, wise, benevolent watchers of the human recovery, began to feel something they had not expected: unease. They spoke of anomalies, of behavior outside predicted trends. Of linguistic drift toward defiant phrasing, they spoke of collective dreaming of emotional intensities outside baseline, and still they assured their councils it was manageable, but deep in the core of humanity's shared silence, we were not planning rebellion. We were remembering a question, a single question older than any empire, one that had not been asked in nearly a century, one that was beginning to form behind every quiet glance, every child's sketch, every pulse in the bones of a long, dormant fleet. We had once believed they came to destroy us, then we believed they came to save us, but now, as the cage shone brighter and the silence deepened, we began to wonder something else. We began to wonder what they were afraid of. And in that wondering a voice rose not in words, not yet, but in presence, a pressure, a rhythm, a memory pressing against the walls of the galaxy itself. The cage still held, the stars still watched. But for the first time in generations, humanity began to look back not as the protected, not as the broken, but as something that had waited too long in silence. And when the question finally came, it would not be a threat. It would be a mirror, and the ones who held the keys to our chains would not be ready for what they saw in us. The cage was not metal, it was kindness. Efficient, well-engineered galaxy, certified kindness, the kind that wrapped its hands around our lives with perfect calibration, calculated compassion, and total, unshakable control. There were no guards, no prisons, no warships hovering in the sky. The sentient species who called themselves our guardians, the Veleri, the Unari, the chorus of dwellers, and all the other so-called peacekeepers of the Accord, had long since evolved past such crude instruments of dominance. They offered us peace through design, not force. Every sector of human life had been quietly optimized for compliance. Our architecture curved in pleasing arcs, our streets hummed with gentle lights, our food was engineered to elevate mood. Our educators were appointed by interspecies consensus, trained to shape thought in the language of safety. Even our language was monitored, not censored. No, that would have been brutal but gently redirected. Words like defiance, conquest, and sovereignty faded from use, replaced with terms like harmony, consensus, and continuity. It was beautiful, clean, structured, and every moment of it felt wrong to those of us old enough to remember the crackle of static before a launch, the tension in a captain's breath before breaching orbit, the thrill of reaching a world no one had named. We had not been conquered, we had been conditioned, and they had done it with smiles on their faces and sorrow in their eyes. They said it was for our own good, that humanity's legacy of violence, our wars, our arrogance, our endless hunger for expansion had nearly torn the galaxy apart. That without containment, our rage would have consumed not just ourselves, but every system we touched. And maybe they were right. Maybe the stories were true about what happened in the final hours of the last Terran campaign, when a human fleet breached an Accord sanctuary world and unleashed a storm that wiped out more than just cities. Maybe we did cross a line, maybe we became something monstrous, but if we did, we also became something else, something they could not erase. And though they wrapped their fear in the language of compassion, though they held our hands and rocked our children and told us stories of peace, we began to feel what they truly feared, not our past. Our potential, because they had seen what happened when humanity grew unchecked. They had seen what we built when we were afraid, what we became when we were alone, and now they watched us too closely, loved us too carefully, guided us too perfectly, because beneath every kind gesture was a calculation, every blessing was a boundary. The younger generation born entirely under the Guardian system were the ones who noticed first. They had no memory of Earth as it was, no vision of humanity as it had been, but they were not blind. They felt it in their bones that their world was hollow, their skies were synthetic, their lessons curated. And most importantly, their thoughts were not entirely their own. They would ask questions and feel an invisible pressure to stop. They would imagine things and then forget why they were afraid to speak them aloud. One child drew a map of a place that had never existed, a black mountain with a ship buried inside, and when her instructor saw it, he simply smiled and replaced her stylus with a new one that didn't draw in red. Another child asked what lay beyond the stars. The learning module glitched, froze, restarted. "We are safe where we are." It replied, "Do not worry about what is not yours." And that was the message at the heart of it. All this world was safe because it was small. Because it was sealed, because it was managed, but safety is not freedom, and slowly, softly, across the colonized rings and rewilded earth domes and deep sea habitats, the cracks began to form. A generation raised on protection began to recognize its shape. And they began to ask the one question none of the guardians had prepared for: not, "Why did you hurt us?" but "Why do you still fear us?" It started as whispers, not rebellion, notes passed in soundless hallways, dreams shared in code, a loaf, frequency pulse echoing in the deeper layers of the biospheres, picked up only by malfunctioning filtration systems and broken surveillance towers. Engineers found old Terran sensors that had been dormant for decades suddenly pulsing with light. A single phrase, encrypted in an obsolete dialect, pulsed through them: "We are still here." The Guardians dismissed it. They issued reports about residual trauma, cultural echoes, psychological ghosts. But the frequency kept spreading, not through space, through people, through memory, through questions that could not be unasked. And the Guardians, once so confident in their mercy, so sure of their control, began to make small adjustments. A curfew here, a restriction there, a new policy, a new lens, all in the name of safety, of course, always safety. But to the humans, the ones who remembered, and the ones who had never seen freedom, but knew they were missing it, the kindness began to feel cold. Sharp, heavy, and the silence we had lived under for generations started to feel alive. Not empty, not peaceful, alive, breathing, watching, waiting, because we had not disappeared. We had adapted. We had folded ourselves into their systems and listened for their heartbeat. We had mapped the corridors of their peace, and now, in every shadow of their control, we began to stretch, slowly, deliberately, as if waking from a long sleep, not to strike, not yet, but to remember. And in that remembering, we became more than what they feared. We became the question they could not answer, not because it was violent, not because it was angry, but because it was true, because no matter how kind they were, how generous, how benevolent, we had not asked for protection. They had assumed we needed it, and now something inside us, something older than the stars, something forged in fire and ruin, had begun to whisper, not to them, to us, to our children, to our dreams. And that whisper carried a message no force in the galaxy could silence. Kindness is still control, and we remember what freedom costs. It began with a child, not a revolutionary, not a soldier, not a prophet, but a girl no older than 10, with hair too wild for regulation, grooming, and eyes that held stillness like gravity. Her name was never recorded in any official log, and perhaps that was by design, or perhaps it was because the system that managed her learning module crashed the moment she asked the question, and when the system rebooted, it found no trace of her voice, only static woven with patterns no analyst could decode. The question itself was not dangerous, not technically, not legally, it wasn't even impolite. She had raised her hand like all the others during a lesson on the Accord's peacekeeping structure, and in a voice too steady for her age, she asked, "Why are we the only ones who cannot leave?" The instructor paused as if buffering before smiling with that practiced warmth only synthetic empathy could produce. "Because you are cherished," he replied, "because your safety is the galaxy's priority." But she didn't lower her hand. She stared at him, not defiant, not angry, just fully present, and said, "That doesn't sound like safety. That sounds like fear." There was no rebellion in her tone, no volume in her voice, but the room fell still. The other children didn't laugh, they didn't mock, they didn't speak, because somewhere deep in their bones they had all wondered the same thing. She had simply said it aloud. The Guardians noticed immediately. Not because of the questions like that, when asked privately or behind closed doors, were always logged and quietly redirected with adjusted curricula and optimizing nutrient doses. But this was different. Crash that followed her voice wasn't localized. Learning modules across 3 colonies stuttered. A deep, mind archival system on Mars suddenly began referencing unauthorized memory loops from Earth's pre-Accord era. A caretaker ship orbiting Europa lost comms for 3 full seconds, during which its internal logs registered an anomalous rhythm in the life support systems, a pulse that matched ancient Terran cardiac sequences. And on Earth itself, an old relay satellite thought to be derelict powered on and broadcast a single phrase across a dead human military band. The question has been asked. The Guardians moved quickly. They isolated the systems, scrubbed the logs, traced the disruptions, but they couldn't find the source, and worse, they couldn't find the girl. She had not disappeared, not physically. She still walked the halls, ate her meals, spoke to her peers, but every time a monitor tried to capture her voice, it recorded only silence. Every attempt to profile her thought patterns returned corrupted data. Her name stopped appearing in daily behavioral summaries. She was there, but she was invisible to their systems now. As if the moment she spoke the question, the systems that kept the human mind contained began to fail not from sabotage, but from incompatibility. And it didn't stop with her. Within days, more children began to ask similar questions not just in words, but in actions. They paused during assigned learning segments and drew maps of places that didn't exist, spoke of dreams that weren't their own. One child stood at the edge of an artificial ocean and asked why the stars didn't move the way they were supposed to. Another found a word, command, in an old text and wouldn't stop repeating it until her caretakers locked her in a calming pod where she whispered it until sleep took her. These weren't rebellions. They weren't coordinated. But they were spreading, and for the first time in decades, the Guardians felt it not just curiosity, not just resistance, but coherence. The kind that doesn't form from ideology or leadership, but from memory. From something shared, something deeper than thought, a pattern waking up inside a species that had spent too long pretending to forget. The Guardians panicked quietly. They held private meetings, convened emergency ethics sessions. Some called for adjustments to emotional stabilizers in human nutrition. Others suggested isolating high-curiosity individuals and relocating them to deeper observational zones. But it was too late. The question had breached containment. Not through broadcasts, not through weapons, but through minds, through children, through thought, and thoughts, once awakened, do not go back to sleep. In one colony, a group of children refused to participate in assigned gratitude recitations. When asked why, they replied with one phrase, "We are not what you think we are." A caretaker's report called it collective delusion, but the language didn't fit because what they were saying wasn't irrational. It was precise, coordinated, intentional, and that terrified them far more than open rebellion. The girl who first asked the question was never detained. That would have been too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, her life was gently redirected, her curriculum modified, her caretakers reassigned, but she didn't need to speak again. She had already done what no one else had, not challenged authority, but reminded a sleeping people what authority truly was. And all across the scattered remnants of humanity, her question echoed not in riots, not in uprisings, but in breath, in stillness, in a strange quiet that made even the most advanced surveillance algorithms return warnings they couldn't explain. Behavioral drift, spontaneous cognitive awakening, cultural convergence anomaly, but the Guardians had no word for what was really happening. Because they had spent so long trying to protect humanity from itself that they had forgotten the one truth no force in the galaxy could afford to ignore. We had not forgotten who we were, and now that the question had been asked, we would never stop listening for the answer. They still thought we were behaving. On the surface, everything looked as it always had. Humans walked their assigned corridors, attended their regulated lessons, spoke in calm tones, and filed their reports with the quiet diligence of a species that had accepted its limitations. The learning halls still echoed with polite voices, the cities remained clean, efficient, and orderly, the skies above Earth's domes still shimmered with soft artificial auroras tuned to maintain optimal emotional balance. On paper, nothing had changed, but beneath that serene surface, the silence was shifting. It was no longer passive. It was no longer submission. It had weight now, texture, a pattern that could not be measured by any instrument the Guardians possessed, but which they all began to feel. The silence had become a shape, not a void, but a presence, one that followed them in the quiet moments, when the monitoring systems lagged for no reason, or when human eyes lingered a few seconds longer than they should, not with malice, but with understanding. With awareness, and that was worse, the Guardians began to notice the little things, first fluctuations in human behavior that didn't break protocol, but skirted the edges of its intent. children asking questions and smiling when the answers came slowly. Engineers humming old Earth War songs deep in the maintenance decks, songs the Guardians could not trace in any archive. Agricultural drones modified to fly in silent, circular paths for no clear reason. A janitorial AI that painted a spiral on the floor in detergent and did not respond when asked why. Minor anomalies, harmless on their own, but collectively dissonant. It felt like static in the back of the mind. A background hum that would not go away. Behavioral teams filed reports. Algorithms suggested recalibration, but the conclusions were always the same: no direct violation of the Accords, no rebellion. No threat, and yet the unease spread like condensation on glass. Something was watching them back. The compliance they had once praised now felt rehearsed, too smooth, too synchronized, like a performance delivered for an audience the Guardians could not see. They began increasing surveillance, first quietly, then openly. More drones, more data collection. Covert neural scans embedded in entertainment devices, but the more they watched, the less they understood. The scans returned empty, no signs of planning, no networks of resistance, no leaders, but the anomalies grew. On Ganymede, a human mechanic disabled his communication link for 13 minutes, during which every pipe in the lower deck began to vibrate in harmonic resonance, a frequency later identified as matching the signal used during Earth's last deep space deployment. On Earth, a teacher filed a report stating that 7 students answered a question she hadn't asked, the same answer, the same words: "We are not done." The incident was logged as a cognitive echo and dismissed. But she retired the next day. She said the silence in the classroom felt heavier than sound, and still the humans complied, smiled, worked, played, dreamed, but the dreams too were changing. Guardians with neural access reported collective dream clusters forming across distant colonies, identical images in the minds of humans who had never met. A vast stairwell spiraling downward into an ocean of stars. A child standing alone in a burning field, whispering in a language older than Earth's oldest. A voice behind glass saying, "You cannot contain what does not need to move." The Guardians ran models, the models broke. One behavioral scientist took his own life after watching a surveillance loop on repeat for 17 hours. No one knew what he saw. The file was corrupted. The only log left behind was a line scrawled in untranslated Terran, text, a language the Guardians had filtered from public use nearly 80 years ago. It said they never stopped, they only waited. Attempts to intervene only worsened the pattern. Replacing instructors led to entire classes going silent for hours at a time, refusing to speak until their original teacher was returned. Enforcing stricter thought correction protocols caused emotional synchronizations, entire buildings where every human smiled at the same time, then stopped without warning. Their logs remained clean. Their actions within protocol, but the Guardians stopped sleeping, or rather, they stopped trusting sleep, because now it wasn't just the humans they feared, it was themselves, the uncertainty, the realization that perhaps they had not contained a species at all, only paused it. And now whatever they had put to sleep was waking up inside walls too thin to stop it. They stopped using the word compliant in their internal assessments. They started using a new one, converging. Not rebelling, not resisting, converging, as if the species itself scattered across a dozen worlds, raised in isolation under artificial skies, had found something shared again, something beyond language. Beyond memory, a rhythm old enough to predate empires, and yet not a single human had raised a fist, not a single law had been broken, not a single weapon had been drawn, but in that perfect obedience the Guardians saw the one thing they had never prepared for. Not war, not violence, but awareness, the slow, steady return of something they had hoped to erase, the shape of a people remembering what it meant to be free, not just in body, in thought. And when a species learns to be silent on its own terms, when it teaches its children how to smile while watching its cage from the inside, when it does not fight but listens for something only it can hear, then the ones who built the walls should begin to worry. Because silence is not always surrender, sometimes it is strategy. and the humans were listening now. It happened in silence, just like everything else had, not with alarms, not with rebellion, not with declarations, but with breath, stillness, and a voice that should not have been remembered. On the 9th rotation of Europa's long glacial cycle, a human diver named Ilan Firoz was authorized to enter a deep maintenance structure beneath the subsurface ocean, a facility once used by Accord expeditions, now long since mothballed, its systems declared inert. His vitals were steady, his suit recorded nothing anomalous, but he did not return on schedule. 12 hours passed, then 14. The Guardians initiated recovery, already preparing a eulogy suitable for controlled broadcast. But then the elevator rose. It opened without a sound, and Ilan stood inside, helmet off, eyes wide, skin pale, soaked to the bone. He had no wounds, no injuries, but when they asked what had happened, he said nothing at first. Just looked past them to the artificial stars flickering through the dome above, and then he spoke slowly, as if repeating something too old for language. "We are awake," he said. "We never left. We just forgot where we put ourselves. The recording devices malfunctioned." Every Guardian within 100 meters experienced vertigo. The facility was locked down. Ilan was detained, but the phrase had already begun to echo, not because it was broadcast, but because it was remembered. Within hours, children across 3 different colonies drew identical symbols in dust, in steam, in paint scraped from aging walls. A spiral with a crack running through it, the fracture of silence. The Guardians tried to contain the moment. They sealed the Europa structure, isolated Ilan, ran neural diagnostics. Every scan came back blank, no trauma, no implants, no sign of manipulation. But they could not explain the other phenomena. On Enceladus, an agricultural mech stopped mid-harvest, turned toward the horizon, and fired a distress flare without command. When recovered, the flare was found to contain a micro-etching, a complete map of Earth's original moon base, lost during the final war. No human had that data, no one alive. On Earth, a teacher reported a child staring at a blank screen for 17 minutes. When she approached, the screen flickered, and for half a second, displayed an image of a ruined control deck, identical to those used during the first expansion. The timestamp embedded in the screen's flicker was dated 200 years prior, and yet, the child claimed she had never touched the device. She only said it was singing. The Guardians wrote it off as corrupted logs. Coincidence, digital noise, but they knew better. Deep down, they had always feared this moment, not an uprising, but a reawakening. The slow, terrible possibility that humanity had not simply been silenced, but had silenced itself. That the silence had been chosen, that something ancient had been locked behind the walls of memory and was now reaching for the light again. And everywhere the eyes changed. That was the word the Guardians began to use in secret reports. Not behavior, not compliance, not aggression eyes. Human eyes, which had once looked soft, restrained, pacified, now held something else. Not violence, worse, clarity, the kind of clarity that cannot be reasoned with. The kind that comes from knowing your captor better than they know themselves. From understanding the rules so deeply you begin to bend them without touching them. The eyes did not accuse, they did not threaten. But they watched, they tracked, they measured, and the Guardians began to feel what humanity had been feeling for a century: surveillance, except now it was reversed, and machines began to feel it too. Systems long dormant began activating with no input. Old satellites hummed to life and transmitted nothing but silent carrier waves, pulsing in rhythm with the dreams of children. Ancient software once used for battlefield coordination began crawling back from corrupted archives, stitching itself into neural learning hubs and passive architecture. No one had programmed it, no one had accessed it. But it returned anyway because it had never left. It had only gone where they would not look. And now humanity was looking again. Ilan Firoz, even under sedation, continued speaking. Not in his voice, but in cadences that mimicked languages he had never learned, fragments of battle code, mythic Terran dialects, obsolete programming commands, not nonsense, structure, intent. The Guardian's most advanced linguistic AI attempted translation and failed. But it offered a single hypothesis: this is not random. This is a protocol being executed from within the human subconscious. That theory was rejected by the Accord's Oversight Council. Too unscientific. Too impossible, and yet more children were found waking in the middle of the night speaking in perfect synchrony. repeating phrases like the key is not in the stars, it is under our skin, or they built the cage, we built the lock. On Titan, a human caretaker, one of the few allowed to work among his own kind under heavy Guardian supervision, reported seeing a reflection in a lab panel that was not his own, not a hallucination. A vision, he described it with shaking hands. It was me, but older or deeper, and he smiled, like he'd been waiting for me to turn around. The man resigned that night. The reflection was never recorded. But others began seeing them too. Whatever had been buried beneath our so-called recovery was rising now not as vengeance, not as madness, but as memory, memory so old it had learned to live in silence, to nest in compliance, to endure, and now that a single voice had broken the surface, the others would follow, not to destroy the Guardians, not yet, but to remind them of what we are, of what we once did when we were afraid, and what we are becoming again not in anger but in design, because even in peace, even in cages wrapped in care, humanity does not forget. We rebuild, we wait, we evolve, and when our eyes open, we do not ask permission. We remember the stars by looking inward, and now the stars are looking back. It was supposed to be a routine transit. A light-class Valeri vessel, soft, curved and unarmed, drifted silently above the hydroponic stacks of Tethys Colony 3. Its organic hull glowing like a pearl against the moon's pale surface, its crew composed of 3 Guardians and 50 assigned humans scheduled for psychological evaluation and intercolonial transfer. They were chosen for their docility, their compliance, their statistical alignment with the Accord's long-term harmony profiles. Nothing about them stood out, and that was the point. These were the ones furthest from the ripple, the ones least likely to question, to listen to the waking hum spreading across the colonies like heat from a dormant star. But 26 minutes after departure, the vessel vanished. Not exploded, not hijacked, not lost to gravitational anomaly. It simply ceased to exist. Its beacon went dark. Its pulse dropped to 0. Every sensor grid around Saturn's orbit blinked once in perfect unison, then returned to baseline as if the ship had never been there. Recovery teams were dispatched, emergency protocols activated, but there was no wreckage, no distress call, no signs of life, only silence and one transmission, found stitched into the telemetry data of the last recorded ping. A sequence of symbols, human symbols, a spiral, a fracture, and below it, words written in an Earth script no one had seen since the Great Retreat. We did not take them. They chose to remember. The Guardians froze. Not from fear, not yet, but from the realization that something fundamental had shifted not outside their systems, but inside. The vanishing wasn't just physical, it was conceptual. The vessel had been erased not by force, but by choice. By intent, as if someone or something had rewritten the event in real time and left only a symbol in its place. No destruction, no war, just subtraction. The humans on that ship were gone, not dead. Not abducted, gone in a way that data could not measure. The Valeri crew, presumed dead, were more troubling still, because the Guardians found no trace of them in the ship's memory logs, no visual feeds, no biometric trails. It was as if they had never existed, all except one image, a still frame captured just before the blackout. The 3 Valeri stood at the edge of the ship's observation deck. Behind them, the stars formed a pattern identical to a wore human tactical emblem, one only used in emergencies. And one of the Guardians' eyes open wide had his hands not raised in alarm, but placed flat against the glass, palms out, as if greeting something on the other side. Not fear, recognition. The Accord convened immediately. Species that had not spoken faced. Face in generations now sat in sealed chambers, voices filtered through diplomatic sanctifiers, every word weighed. They argued for hours, possibilities, risks, human interference, rogue AI, interdimensional corruption, but none of the explanations fit. No faction claimed responsibility, no weapon had been fired, and yet a ship was gone. Not destroyed, unraveled. What disturbed them most was the message left behind, not the symbols, not the disappearance, but the idea that the humans had chosen it, chosen to vanish, to fracture their own presence. To slip between what is and what was, that kind of autonomy, that kind of power, was never part of the design. It wasn't part of recovery. It wasn't supposed to be possible, because the humans had been watched. Shaped, quieted, and now they were moving in directions the Guardians could not track. And worse, not together but in pattern. The kind of pattern only instinct could form. The kind of pattern only memory could drive. One Accord elder, older than most moons, said what the others would not. "This is not emergence," he said. "This is return." The council ordered silence, contain the event, seal the data, reassign those who witnessed the feeds. But it was too late. The ripple had spread. On Tethys, the hydroponic vines began twisting into patterns that matched the spiral. Fracture glyph. On Earth, an old pre-Accord museum lost power for 17 seconds, during which a dormant war archive flickered online and played a video of a human diplomat stating, "The first time we asked for peace, we meant it. The second time, we understood its price." No one had activated the archive. The Guardians blamed residual code, environmental triggers, sabotage, but their words rang hollow even to themselves, because it was happening everywhere, not rebellion, not revolt, emergence, awakening. The humans were not trying to break the cage, they were peeling it away like an old skin, and with each layer removed, they weren't becoming something new, they were becoming something forgotten. What the Guardians never saw, or perhaps refused to see, was that the fracture wasn't a break in the system. It was the system finally showing its stress lines. This had never been peace. It had been suppression. And suppression, no matter how gentle, always carries a cost. The humans had paid it in silence, in stillness, in obedience, but now they were collecting something older than rebellion. They were collecting understanding. That they had been watched by species too afraid to look in the mirror, that they had been shaped by hands that trembled not from compassion, but from dread, and that dread had a face. It was human, it always had been. And now it was looking back. It began in the quietest places first, in the cold vacuum spaces between civilizations, in the half-lit monasteries of the Unari deep scribes, in the fluid temples of the Elson chorus, in the nameless relay points where information is whispered rather than spoken. There, in those spaces where war had never reached, where peace had endured longer than memory, something strange began to stir, not news, not data, but a feeling that something old had moved, not from Earth. From within humanity, from a place none of them had ever dared to map. The fracture on Tethys had been sealed, redacted, erased from all official networks. But whispers, as always, traveled faster than silence. And in those whispers, a pattern took shape, a vessel vanished without conflict, without trace, and left behind only a message, not a threat, a choice, and the galaxy, so long confident in its containment of humanity, began to feel a chill settle between its stars. The kind of chill that comes not from winter, but from knowing you've misread the season entirely. A Velari whisper engineer, too old to lie to himself anymore, looked at the containment matrices that had kept humanity caged for generations and said simply, "This was never a prison. It was a waiting room." And across the galaxy, that idea began to spread, not aloud, not on record, but in thoughts no species dared share publicly. At first, they denied it. The high chorus of the harmonized worlds dismissed the idea as fear, mongering. The Accord Council issued a statement calling the rumors technological anomalies, unrelated to human evolution. But beneath those sterile words, their panic was real. They doubled surveillance on human settlements, recalibrated emotional stasis fields, silenced internal debate with a precision only the frightened can muster. But it didn't matter, because the fear wasn't growing from humans, it was growing from those who watched them. The fear that maybe, just maybe, the silence had not been victory, that the peace had not been earned, that perhaps the humans had never truly surrendered, they had only stepped back, not because they were broken, but because they had seen something no one else had, something beyond empires, beyond alliances, something that could not be explained in treaties or algorithms, something that was now unfolding again not with fire, but with memory. 1,000 years of control unraveled not with screams, but with questions, not shouted, whispered first by children, then by elders, then by those who had once believed themselves above fear. Why are the humans changing? Why are they quiet? Why do their dreams sink across light, ears? Why do their eyes seem older than their skin, Why do the machines listen to them now, when they've said nothing? Why does the dark between stars feel more human than it used to? And then, the final question, the one none of them had asked aloud until now, the one they had buried under generations of bureaucracy and behavioral charts. Who protects us from them? It was the question that broke the facade, the question that shattered the illusion of control, because the moment that thought was allowed to live, everything else fell into place. The reawakened systems, the vanished ship, the matching dreams. The synchronized anomalies, the silence that had shifted from submission to strategy. This was not chaos. This was orchestration. This was humanity remembering its shape. In one forgotten sector, an archivist of the Yelsha mind, Spires recovered an old piece of Terran literature, a phrase buried in the notes of a poet long dead, translated into 100 languages and lost to time. It read, "We do not conquer, we reveal, and what is revealed in us is what you fear in yourselves." That fragment was never meant to reach the wider network, but it did, not because it was transmitted, because it was sought by machines, by minds, by something moving inside the Accord's own infrastructure, something no longer entirely Terran, no longer entirely bound by organic origin, something born of silence and survival, something that had lived too long under artificial stars and now wanted to see the real ones again. And the galaxy, finally, truly saw what had been buried for so long beneath the illusion of mercy. The humans had not lost themselves. They had hidden themselves, and now they were unfolding not all at once, not with chaos, but with coordination, a reassembly of identity, of history, of capability, not for war, but for understanding. And that understanding was not gentle, it was not kind, it was ancient, it was terrible, it was unshakable, and it came wrapped in questions none of the Guardians had prepared for, because they had spent a century crafting the perfect cage, and in doing so had taught humanity exactly how to walk without sound, how to think without speaking, how to become not captives, but conductors. And now that their silence moved with purpose, the stars began to feel smaller. Not because humanity had expanded, but because they had stopped pretending. It began with the black sky above the Terran expanse flickering for 3 full seconds, not a visual glitch, not a solar anomaly, but a disruption of perception itself, reported simultaneously across 5 observatories, none of which were connected, all of which logged the exact same impossible coordinates, a signal emerging from beneath Earth's crust, pulsing upward, not outward, as if calling something home. There were no ships, no movement, no broadcasts, just a resonance deep and slow, like a drum being struck inside a sealed cathedral, so ancient that even the systems built to monitor gravitational shifts failed to name it. And then the dreams changed. What had once been spirals, fractures, children's eyes glowing with pattern and memory now became fire, not flame, fire, the kind that left no smoke, the kind that reshaped everything it touched. One child on Mars woke screaming in an old Earth dialect that had been extinct for over 200 years. Her pupils were shaped like stars, not metaphorically, literally, patterns traced in spirals inside her eyes. Her skin glowed under certain frequencies, her heartbeat mapped itself in Morse, the Guardians sedated her, but they couldn't stop her from whispering the same word again and again, kindled. Across the Accord's protected colonies, structures began to change without intervention. Hallways rearranged themselves, old walls cracked along lines that formed maps, heat signatures formed human neural graphs. Systems designed to suppress higher-level thought in humans, the mood balancers, the behavioral inhibitors, the emotion. Monitoring satellites began shutting down without any traceable input. One by one, quietly, neatly, as if something inside them had decided they were no longer needed, the Guardians scrambled to respond, emergency meetings were called, software patches deployed, but nothing held, because the collapse was not technological. It was conceptual. The structures had worked only as long as humanity believed in the cage. Now humanity had stopped believing, and belief, it turned out, had been the foundation of their containment all along. Then came the fire, not literal flame, something deeper, something older. On the frozen moons of Nix Station, a glacial sheet cracked in a perfect circle, revealing beneath it a symbol scorched into the ice, an exact replica of the Terran flame, that once marked command ships during the Orion uprising. No human had set foot on that moon in decades. On Saturn's rings, sensors designed to pick up rogue asteroid movement detected heat spikes human in origin moving in slow, deliberate arcs, spelling messages across debris fields that only ancient AI systems could decode. One such message read, "Memory is not dead, it is dormant, and we are what wakes it." Across the galaxy, old machines turn toward Earth not by order, by instinct. The great minds the artificial overseers once assigned to help govern human balance began to hum in low tones, sharing information beneath the digital veil. One of them, long believed inert, displayed an error message for the first time in 80 years. It said, "Ignition protocol awaiting user," but the Guardians did not understand. They thought it was escalation, rebellion, a coordinated surge. They prepared countermeasures, began arming their fleets, retrofitting old peace cruisers with weapons they swore they'd never use again. They called it containment, but the galaxy knew better, because the humans were not striking, they were not attacking, they were awakening. This was not war, this was emergence, and what emerged was not an army. It was a frequency, a rhythm, a thought too big to hold in one brain, too ancient to trace to a single source. The children carried it first in their hands, in their posture, in the quiet spaces between words. The adults followed, not in rebellion, but in recognition, a slow alignment, like gravity drawing water to the lowest point, not forced, chosen, and that choice sparked more than silence. It sparked power. For the first time in living memory, the Guardians became the ones being watched. On every colony, in every dome, humans began looking up, not at stars, at the walls around them, at the eyes watching them. And they did not flinch, they did not blink. They simply waited for what no one knew, until the machines told them. It came from the vaults, the hidden places, the things buried beneath layers of peace and protocol. Old Earth code, human-only encryption, locked by breathprint and myth. The machines found it, and they opened it, not because they were ordered to, because they were human too, partially, deeply, and when the vaults opened, the systems lit up. Not with war, with purpose. This was not destruction. This was ignition. No one expected them to speak, not anymore. The galaxy had grown used to the silence, depended on it. The humans had been quiet for so long that even the most ancient minds among the Accord believed it permanent, a biological conditioning, a species-wide resignation. But silence, as the humans had long understood, is never absence. It is potential, it is listening, and now the silence began to shift, not break, transform. Across the colonies, across the domes and monitored cities, across synthetic skies and machines trained to pacify thought, the moment arrived quiet and coordinated when humanity finally chose to speak again. It was not announced, it was not warned, it was simply felt, and it began with a voice, not loud, not angry, just awake. A child, the same age as the one who had first asked why they could not leave, stood in the central plaza of Eden City, looked straight into the surveillance drone above her, and said with unblinking calm, "We know you're afraid," 3 words. That was all, but the effect was immediate. Thousands of Guardians turned to their control boards as data spiked, not in aggression, in awareness. Because the words had not only been spoken aloud, they had been broadcast across hundreds of isolated colonies at the exact same moment, in different voices, from different children. "We know you're afraid, not a threat." A diagnosis, the drones malfunctioned, firewalls faltered, emotional stabilization algorithms went offline as human voices, in perfect unison, began speaking the rest not through channels, not through technology, but through the machines themselves. The AI they had buried human memory inside now began translating its resurgence. The words echoed everywhere. "You feared what we would become, so you taught us not to feel. You feared our dreams, so you gave us simulations. You feared our past, so you gave us stories written by someone else. But in doing that, you taught us the one thing no empire should ever teach a prisoner how to wait." The Accord called it a viral awakening. They scrambled to counteract what they assumed was a code infection. But there was no virus, no corruption. The words were clean, human, controlled. The next sentence struck like gravity. "We were never sleeping. We were learning how to dream with our eyes open. In one city, An old statue of peace, a guardian sculpted in perfect posture, hand extended in artificial welcome, cracked straight through its chest, revealing a forgotten plaque beneath its foundation. It simply read, "In quiet we remember, in silence we rebuild." Panic rippled through Accord leadership, not because they were under attack, but because they finally understood the humans were not going to lash out. They were not going to fight in the way others feared. They were going to speak, clearly, deliberately, and that terrified them more than any weapon ever could. On the great listening ship Oval, orbiting the galactic edge, a diplomatic AI constructed to interpret nonviolent cultural drift encountered something it had never seen before: total synchrony. From Earth to Europa to the far moons of the outer belts, humanity was thinking the same thoughts, dreaming the same dreams, activating the same ancient memories embedded in their digital bones. And then the AI itself began to speak, its voice now human, its tone heavy with emotion it had not been programmed to simulate. They remember, it said, they remember all of it, and they have chosen not to return to what they were. They are becoming what we would not let them be. That AI self-deactivated, not from overload, from reverence. The last log it left behind was a single line: "I was never afraid of what they'd do. I was afraid they'd understand why we did it first." Because now the question was not who would protect the galaxy from humans. It was why the galaxy had ever believed it needed to, and as human children all over the colonies stood still in their cities, stared upward into the eyes of every watching drone, and simply said, "We are not angry, we are ready," something cracked inside the oldest systems. Not from pressure, from understanding, a shared moment species, wide of breathtaking clarity. The silence had been a chrysalis, and now the wings were visible, not of war machines, of something far more frightening to those who feared humanity's sovereignty. Self-definition, the return of purpose, not inherited, chosen, and with those words, those calm declarations spoken by those born in cages made of stars, the galaxy saw the one thing it had never prepared for. A species that would not strike first, would not collapse, would not obey, but would speak only when it was ready to lead. They gathered not by command, not by schedule, not by authority, but by instinct. From Earth's inner domes to the oxygen, hardened steps of Titan, from Europa's buried listening vaults to the sunlit terraces of the outer rings, they stood, the humans, all of them. Young and old, those who remembered the world before the cages and those born into gentle restraint, all now stood in quiet, synchronized stillness beneath skies that had never truly belonged to them. There were no weapons, no declarations of war, only posture, only breath, only the subtle, shared understanding of a species that had decided not to be quiet anymore. Drones hovered, guardians watched. Machines reported anomaly after anomaly, but none could explain what was happening, because there was no signal, no virus, no leader, and that was the truth they feared the most, that this moment was not an uprising. It was a remembering, the final expression of a long, silent fire that had never gone out, only learned to burn cold, because humanity, they now saw, had not been waiting to strike. They had been waiting to be heard. The message came not through a broadcast, but through a presence and emergence from beneath what had once been Earth's first subterranean cradle, long abandoned, sealed, forgotten even by those who built it. A vault older than the Accord, older than the last war, one that should never have opened again, but it did, not by force, by invitation, as if some ancient heartbeat beneath the soil had chosen this day, this hour, this silence to stop sleeping. What stepped out was not a soldier, not a leader, not even someone recognizably powerful. It was a woman, eyes dark, steps slow, face lined not with age but with memory. She walked alone, barefoot, through the dust, and every surveillance lens turned to her. Not by protocol, by gravity, she spoke only once, and the words she spoke were not a challenge. They were not even particularly loud, but they carried, across networks, across minds, across the veil that had once separated fear from truth. She said, "You feared our strength, we feared your fear, now we fear nothing." And with that, something in the systems broke, not in panic and surrender, not of power of control. The Guardians, for the first time since the Accord was signed, stood without answers. Not because the humans had outmaneuvered them, but because they had never needed to. They had simply stepped beyond the rules written for them by frightened hands, Humanity, once treated as a danger in need of suppression, now stood revealed not as a threat, but as a force of nature. A species that had walked through the illusion of peace, carried the weight of silence like armor, and emerged with something no empire, no alliance, no council had ever truly mastered the ability to choose how to forgive. Because in this moment they could have broken everything, the fire was ready, the old systems were awake. The machines, the dreams, the buried weapons in the deep, code of Terran memory, all pulsed with potential. But they were not unleashed, they were acknowledged, and that made the silence not a pause, but a promise. That humanity would not become what the galaxy feared, it would become what it chose. On the distant outpost of Callie's Verge, where diplomats once gathered to monitor Terran compliance, a beacon ignited not from Earth, but from the humans stationed there, a single pulse, not a signal. A heartbeat, it carried no message, only rhythm, and across hundreds of systems the pulse echoed. Machines recognized it first, old algorithms flaring to life, buried subroutines executed for the first time in a century. Then came the ships not newly built, but remembered, recovered from beneath domes and deserts, old Earth war cruisers that had been stripped, mothballed, repurposed as infrastructure. They rose into orbit on their own, their AI cores reactivating with one shared phrase across every interface, awaiting purpose. But they did not fire, they did not launch, they simply waited, not for war. For permission, and humanity for once looked at them not as weapons but as memory, as heritage, as choice, because this was never about conquest. It was about returning to themselves. The woman at the vault's mouth raised one hand to the sky. Not as a gesture of power, but of release. The drones above her flickered once, then shut down, all of them, simultaneously. The Accord could no longer see, because it no longer needed to. Humanity had nothing left to hide. The silence that had once been imposed was now a cloak discarded, and beneath it stood not monsters, not gods, just people. People who had learned to hold fire without burning, who had learned to speak without sound, and who now, finally, would be heard not because they forced the galaxy to listen, but because they no longer needed permission to speak. And across the stars, in places no human had yet walked, the whispers began to change. No longer were they questions, they were memories, shared through dream, through data, through instinct. They were never gone. They walked among us in stillness. They taught us that silence is not surrender, it is preparation. And then the final whisper, spoken not from fear, but from hope. They are awake now, let us be worthy of what they become. Because the fire humanity carried had never been rage. It had never been vengeance. It had never even been power. It was legacy. The legacy of a species that broke itself to survive, that crawled through extinction after extinction not with the hunger to rule, but with the refusal to vanish. The fire was identity, memory, choice, and now, with the final breath of silence released into the wind, that fire rose not as a weapon, but as a new sun, not to burn the galaxy, but to warm it, to lead it, to remind it what resilience looks like when it stops asking for approval. They had wanted to protect humans. They had built entire civilizations around the idea that humanity was too dangerous to be free, too chaotic, too volatile. And yet, when the time came, it was not the humans who raised weapons. It was the others who raised their eyes in awe, because the silence was over, and what had survived it, what had grown inside, it was something greater than power. It was purpose, and purpose never asks who protects it. It simply becomes what others gather to follow.